start the
Correct.
work session.
Yep.
And you are live.
Just a reminder.
Welcome everybody to what's essentially an out-of-cycle planning commission meeting on March 10th. At this point, I'd like to call the meeting to order. And with us today, we have all of the commission members except Ben Sales. So myself, Alex Pline, Vice Chair Bob Waldman, Tom Sparkianudis, Teresa Rubio Dorsey, Diane Butler, David Iams, our recorder Kimberly Consoli, Tom Smith, Mike Melanoff, Jackie Rouse, etc. And we have several aldermen here and alderwomen for the work session in a little bit. Anyway, the only thing that I wanted to mention is that we will not be meeting on our regular day, March 17th, but we will be back on the 31st to continue where we were last week on the Bay Village project. Anyway, with that, there's nothing else on the agenda, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. So moved.
We got a second?
I'll second if I didn't first.
Okay, thanks. And any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so that ends the sort of the official part of the meeting tonight, but we're going to stay on YouTube for the work session coming up here. And so I just wanted to make a few comments about the work session, especially for Teresa and Tom's benefit, since this is their first time with the work session. Typically, so I'll just make a few introductory remarks about that and try to set some expectations about how things will go tonight. Generally, these work sessions are essentially off the record, typically around, at this point, a virtual roundtable discussion about a piece of legislation or a project. It could be, often we meet with a developer who wants to do a project before they put an application in. It's a way to have a free exchange of ideas off the record without, being constrained by rules and process and that kind of stuff. So this really lets us discuss ideas and have a free flow of information. Typically, these are open to the general public. So if we were meeting in chambers, the general public can come, and obviously they can watch on YouTube and watch it later. But generally, we don't allow. It's not public testimony or public hearing, so we generally don't allow participation from the general public. Although we have done in the past especially if it's some sort of development, if members of the public do have questions, when we've been in chambers, we've allowed them to write things down on a piece of paper and entertain, asking their questions and stuff. But generally, we want to keep it to just us, to keep it kind of under control. So we're going to talk tonight about 0922, which is Alderman Schandelmeyer and Alderwoman O'Neill's legislation on minimum parking requirements for restaurants. And I think the way we should start out is why don't we have just a very short presentation from staff, and then we'll turn it over to the legislation sponsors to talk more about it.
Alex,
Yep.
can I jump in here before you hand it over to staff?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
I just want to state that, that everything we say in these work sessions should not be taken, as an indication that we lean a certain way or that we do a certain thing. Normally these aren't recorded, and we are actually recording this because it's on YouTube. So, first of all, I don't think Kimberly needs to be here because she's not taking minutes.
Right. Yeah. We talked before you came on. We talked about that, and
yeah, I just wanted to be aware that even though it's being recorded, we're not any indication, anything we say here, we can't be held accountable for it that way.
Right. Yeah, that's what I meant. This is really just a free flowing exchange of ideas, on this particular topic. And I think you make a really good point, David, is, nobody should construe what anybody says here as an acknowledgement of support or otherwise for anything we've talked about here. It's just a way for us to understand the issue better in a less constrained environment. So with that, as we talk about this, obviously this is about a piece of legislation, but it's really not our wheelhouse to discuss, things like amendments to the legislation, for example, because we don't, as a planning commission, we don't write legislation. All we do eventually when we talk about this officially is we make recommendations on the legislation. So I just want to set the expectation here that I don't want to get into a long discussion about how to change this. That any amendments, changes to the legislation will happen downstream, even downstream from the official planning commission recommendations. That's really the legislative branch. That's their wheelhouse to start amending this as they see fit, if that ends up happening. But so I really wanted to keep this to a discussion of the ideas around this this particular piece of legislation and the general idea of minimum parking requirements, since this legislation is talking about removing them in some cases. So with that,
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for interrupting, but after the staff presentation is over, I did prepare a brief presentation of my own just on this, if I can show that when staff is done.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I wanted to do, is have staff just, because that's sort of our typical flow. Staff will give an overview, and then we'll turn it over to you, Alderman Chandler-Meyer and Alderwoman O'Neill, to do a presentation, and then you're free to sort of take it in whatever direction, however you want to present that. And I think because this is kind of a free flow of ideas, and what I'd like to do is, as you guys are giving any presentation or talking about it, I'd like to have us entertain questions as we go. But I'll try to moderate as best I can so that we don't go off on a tangent that gets you to, get you off track. So while I think it's good that we can have interspersed questions here, let's all try not to get straight too far and get you off track. So I personally, I'm a fan of the raising the hand feature in Zoom here. So that'll help. Keep it under control. Okay, so that's my expectations for the night, and hopefully we won't go more than an hour and a half to 2 hours. Okay, so with that, so for staff-wise, Eric, are you gonna take over and go? Okay.
I'm here to give a few comments. So thanks to Jackie Rouse and the department for helping set this up, and our acting director Mike Malinoff is here as well as current planning chief Tom Smith, I believe. And so just to clarify, I mean, the legislation is sort of out of the gate at this point, which means that as staff, we're here as sort of objective observers, expertise providers, technical resources, and we hope we can be of service to the commission. And so we certainly support the work session because there is a sort of simplicity in the way the legislation is written, but it has potentially profound consequences on the city, in both positive and potentially negative. So we want to understand what those might be, although it's always hard to predict what will happen. But that's what we're here to do, is to talk about what we think this legislation will do for the city, and parking is the way I think about it, it's a fundamentally a land use question. It's in the way we allocate parking in the city, anywhere parking is allocated. You're making a value judgment as to how important that is as a land use. And so that's kind of a fundamental question here. It has implications towards commerce in the city, towards our environment, towards circulation, access. Those are some of the things on my mind. This isn't the first time, the city has addressed parking, obviously. And even though I'm relatively new in my role, I've looked back at some of the plans that the city has done that have addressed parking in some ways. I think, I have a hunch that Eastport might come up tonight. And one of the plans that was done there in 2016, the Eastport Transportation Study, I think was a very well done plan. It has a section related to parking. I think for anybody listening to this work session at home, you can find that study. You can find the existing conditions report that comes with that on the city's website. If you really just Google Eastport Transportation Study, you'll find a link to the page on our planning and zoning website. More recently, the Maritime Task Force addressed this sort of indirectly. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in the strategy that came out of that task force in the report, one of the most challenging, I was a part of that task force as a city staff person, and dealing with the potential for change in the maritime districts and the desire to preserve and support the maritime industry led to challenging discussions about how restaurants fit into that mix of land uses. And, I think it was clear coming out of that task force, there was consensus as it relates to the districts that restaurants would have a significant impact on the districts, and there was consensus as to where those restaurants would make the most sense, and consensus as to where they would have an oversized impact and potentially push out maritime uses. So that is another recent planning study. It was just adopted by resolution from City Council in November, or actually October, I believe, of 21, and that also is available on the city's planning and zoning website. So with that, the only other things I would like to share are that, as the chairman mentioned, there is a mechanism for providing comments by the general public here, not tonight, but we will have a public hearing on this. We're looking at dates for the end of March or early April. We have not finalized that date yet. March 31st or April 7th are kind of two candidates right now. And we will be accepting, I should say the Planning Commission will be accepting comments up until noon on the day of that hearing. So anybody wishing to submit comments can do so through the Planning Commission's website. We're starting to see comments coming in. Those go to Jackie Rouse in our department, and they're provided to the Planning Commission prior to the public hearing. So I just encourage anybody who wants to chime in on this legislation to do so in that way. And yeah, unless anybody else from staff has a comment, I think we can turn it over to the sponsors of the legislation.
Sounds good.
Alex, we have sent you some background materials that Eric and I pulled together,
Right.
and
Yep.
as Alderman Chandelmeyer had sent you materials. But if there are other things that you would like in terms of research, we would be happy to provide those also.
Just if you happen to have the last chapter of Shoup's book scanned, I think that would be valuable. I just didn't. My scanning setup here is rather pedestrian, so I didn't get a chance to.
I think we can probably accomplish that. I'll figure out how to do it. I did send out an additional a Shoup document that was a update that Shoup did on his. It was 25 pages.
Yeah, it's good.
So
anyway, that's the only other thing that I can think of at this point.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's turn it over to Alderman Chandelmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the commission, I appreciate your time and willing to go over this. So I've created a presentation for this legislation. It is worth noting that this is part one of what is going to be a lot more parking requirement reform legislation to come. I had separated this off from a larger bill because I felt like this was a significantly more simple concept for people to grasp. And the larger bill I am still working on and tweaking and making edits in that front. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen and start the presentation.
Please do.
All right. Can everybody see the whole presentation?
Yes, good.
Excellent. All right, 0922 and parking reform. So this is basically how parking requirements help our environment. Ending parking requirements will help our environment, increase our city's walkability, and help build community space. So Jane Jacobs, the author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, describes the parking lot as a border vacuum, a wasted space hostile to people, spreading out the city with dead seas of asphalt. As we can see here, this is a picture taken from the Kohl's, Lidl, Chick-fil-A giant sprawling parking lot. That is, I think, one of the best case examples of a lot that is not even during the normal times on the peak of hours, used up to more than a third full. This was not the developer's choice. This was not the restaurants or the banks or the store's choice. This was city mandated. All of this dead asphalt. Parking requirements hurt our environment. They hurt our walkability. They hurt our community. And most importantly, they hurt our city as a whole. This is another example of, even under the normal times, a parking lot at Clock Tower Plaza that even at peak hours is no more than a third full. This was not the office's choice. This was not the restaurant or the store's choice. This was not the developer's choice. This was city mandated dead asphalt. Environmental impacts of parking requirement, I think, are very important for everyone. And I want to start this off by quoting Lewis Mumford in The Cities in History. The right to access every building in a city by private motor car in an age when everyone owns such a vehicle is actually the right to destroy the city. Lewis Mumford in The City in History wrote this. He was a man who did not particularly agree with Jane Jacobs on much, but on parking requirements and the forcing of dead asphalt, they were in lockstep. Parking requirements force more impervious surface, they force more sprawl, they force more traffic congestion, and they lead to less transit. More impervious surface because, as I've said several times, this is government mandating more impervious asphalt. This leads to increased runoff and flooding in our environmentally sensitive area. And this was actually something I found researching this through a study called The Causal Effect of Impervious Cover on Annual Flood Magnitude for the United States by Bloom et al. In Advancing Earth and Space Sciences. Every percentage of increased asphalt increases flooding by 3.3%. Parking requirements lead to more sprawl. Majority of this land that we are seeing is cleared for the parking that is never used to more than a third full in this particular development. This was not the restaurant's choice. This was not the developer's choice. This was city mandated dead sprawl. And I think the most important thing for us to realize is when you look at the overall parking lot, it is bigger than the Lido's Pizza, the CVS, the Soul, the Shiki Sushi, and every other single building in this combined, there is more space dedicated to car storage. It also leads to more traffic congestion. One of the interesting things I've found out is that more parking leads to more driving. In this figure here, which is from what residential lotteries show us about transportation choices, it shows that when there is more increased parking availability, driving frequency goes up as well, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of that figure. Now, why this is because it spreads things out to a point where any other alternative to mobility beyond the personal automobile is unfeasible. It creates hostile spaces for walking, which I will get into. It prevents any kind of adequate transit, which I will get into in the next slide. And the importance of this is that personal automobiles are actually the largest producer of American greenhouse gases, making up 29% of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas in the United States. And for that, I am citing the EPA. Also leads to less transit. In order for any kind of frequent all-day bus service, which is the minimum amount of, which is the lowest degree of transit that cities can provide, it requires about 15 to 30 active units per acre. I am citing the Sprawl Repair Manual by Galina Takiva from Island Press in 2010. And this parking requirements force the spreading out of more space and more clearance, and it makes this density impossible to achieve. And again, as a result, this leads to increased uses in cars, which, as I showed earlier instead of the EPA, leads to increase in carbon dioxide. This is why Donald Shoup in his new book, Parking in the City, has stated, improving parking policies could be the cheapest, quickest, and most politically feasible way to achieve many social, economic, and environmental goals. Parking requirements will hurt our walkability. I'm going to quote Catherine King here. Broadly, the built environment refers to aesthetic, physical, and functional qualities of land use patterns, buildings, and streetscapes that together provide opportunities for physical activity and active transport. This is a picture of the strip malls containing Brewster's and El Cabrito and the Latin Market and Little Italy, taken across the street, across Forest Drive from the Clock Tower Plaza. And why I wanted to show this is a facility that I frequently walk to myself. It is also a facility that I have very frequently almost been hit by cars, because this exact parking requirement forces strip mall developments more often than not, and that leads to significantly more dangerous and hostile pedestrian interactions. Hostile conditions such as heat. This is a fun little experiment I did about 2 summers ago during one of our heat waves where I cracked an egg on the sidewalk. And as you can see, after about a couple hours, the egg is literally cooked. Why is it cooked? Because of the heat island impact. Temperatures often reach 1 to 7 degrees higher in parking lots and areas with high asphalt during the day, and temperatures often reach 1 to 5 degrees higher at night. These are exacerbated during multiple day heat waves, which are becoming increasingly common. This is one of the many hostilities created by large parking lots because people don't like feeling cooked when they're going for a walk and trying to go about their business. As a result of this, more people take cars. Hostile conditions such as distance. The parking requirements force more sprawl because the city has mandated more space to be taken up for dead asphalt. And this actually causes a lot of issues for disabled and older individuals that cannot drive themselves safely. It essentially traps them unless they have someone else to give them a ride. This is why the AARP has actually created the Walk Audit Toolkit and the 20-Minute Village initiatives that have stressed the importance of allowing denser developments and more walkable mixed-use spaces. And I'm going to be quoting Robert Ping here, who was a major contributor for the AARP. Walking is a comfortable experience when you're not passing vast parking lots or blank walls with no windows. This is, again, something how we can do a very minor thing to increase the walkability and the overall mobility of some of our most vulnerable residents. Hostile conditions such as safety. This is a picture of our local McDonald's out on Outer West Street. And pedestrian fatalities, I don't know if many of you are aware, actually went up 3.9% in 2020 from 2019. And AAA Mid-Atlantic estimates that actually 30% of pedestrian accidents are in these parking lots. This is because these large asphalt parking spaces tend to increase faster driving speeds and lead to more frequent and severe accidents. In every major American city, pedestrian deaths are part of life. Often the victim is a child. The news cycle is predictable. First comes the victim blaming, then the driver blaming. Throughout it all, the crash is called an accident, as if it were not presentable. This is from Walkable City Rules by Jeff Speck, widely considered one of the most respected urban planners in increasing mobility and walkability for cities. The community impacts of parking requirements. Parking requirements, the kind that you find in your local zoning code, are based on a sham science and are not in any way defensible beyond citing their existence in a code book. This is from Strong Towns author and creator Charles Marone. And he's right. They create this essential dead asphalt space, as I've stated time and time again, and they hurt our city's business productivity, our city's finances, and our community's place building by creating this hostile zone for everything. They hurt businesses because what I'm going to cite here is from the EPA, that on-site parking spaces can add $2,000 to $20,000 in annual costs on average in maintenance and lost revenue. And building new parking spaces can add 5 to 15% to the monthly costs of building rents. This is because it reduces the amount of usable space and it reduces the amount of productive space for each business. They also hurt our city finances. This figure here on the right was actually put together by a member of the American Planning Association, Mr. Quentin Cummings, and it shows the amount of revenue per acre for the city's finances. The gray areas are owned by the state or their preserved land or HACA properties, so they are completely grayed out. We get no revenue for them. That is a different issue entirely. But the bluer areas that have less parking lots produce more revenue per acre for the city. They are financially productive places. The green and the tan places are dominated by the traditional suburban sprawl model, large parking lots, large spread out, low density development that creates dead weight for our city finances because we need to still connect all of these areas with infrastructure costs that remain the same as the denser spots, and we have less people paying into them. The denser spots are subsidizing the rest of our city where we forced sprawl. And it hurts communities. I know this isn't a fun or a desperate picture of, I didn't know this is an informative picture, but the New Yorker released that fun cartoon. The city is going to hell. This used to be a parking lot. And that's because this is it's funny because it is a significantly more productive use of space. I'm going to quote Palaces for the People by Eric Kleinenberg. Watering holes are hubs of social activity in societies across the planet. Humans form cities because it creates social bonds and makes their overall survival as a species easier. And the joys of urban life are interacting with each other in these public spaces. Parking lots are dead space that discourage socializing. They limit the amount of interaction due to forcing more car trips, which prevent any kind of interaction on the street. And they limit interaction due to the wasted use of space at the location itself. And this reduces community social bonds and building of unique community spaces. Actually, in the book Palaces for the People, Eric Kleinenberg states that one of the leading causes of social disillusion is the lack of social infrastructure and these public gathering spaces that we have seen in our society that have been occurring more frequently due to the sprawl development pattern being adopted in the late 40s in many American cities and continuing on and on. So, are we the only city talking about reducing our parking requirements? He says leadingly, no. These are just many other cities that are considering this. Boston, Massachusetts, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, South Bend, Indiana, Sacramento, California, Richmond, Virginia. Hell, Alexandria, Virginia is considering parking maximums. This is a trend. Smart cities are realizing that the environmental destruction, the financial destruction, the community destruction, and the walkability destruction of parking requirements are a bad deal for them. These are cities big and small. This is a trend that many smart cities are taking up, and we would be foolish to not do it ourselves. Thank you.
All righty. Do you have any other things you want to present or words you want to say? And
I think I've said pretty bluntly and showed a lot of pictures of dead spaces of asphalt my feelings on this issue. Every single urban planning literature that has come out since Jane Jacobs has shown that parking spaces and parking requirements hurt our cities. Now, I know the argument's going to come up, well, we're not a walkable city, so we need our parking spaces. Oh, we're not a transit city, so we need our parking spaces. And that's bollocks. Walkability and transit-oriented things are choices. We choose to maintain the parking space, and that continues the problems with walkability and transit. Saying we can't, it's the equivalent of saying we can't solve the problem because the problem exists. We can make a choice to become the walkable, environmentally friendly city that each of us keeps saying we need to be, or we can keep talking about it and doing absolutely nothing.
So do you have, Alderwoman O'Neill, do you have anything you want to add before we sort of jump into any questions or?
I would just like to add that I decided to come on and sponsor with Brooks because after reading the ideas and looking at it, I do agree that Annapolis can move in this direction and should be moving in this direction. And actually having the parking garage downtown out of service for the next 14 to 16 months is sort of a prime time to have this going on as people turn to transit. We spend a lot of time talking about our transit, and our ridership is down, and our we're not being as effective as we can. And if we really want to keep in our transit, we need to take a look at it, and perhaps giving people the opportunity to look at transit in a different way than just for somebody that doesn't have a car. This is one move in that direction.
Thanks. And so Alderman Arnett, you have some questions, comments?
I do. Thank you. I couldn't help notice, and by the way, Brooks, I would love to get a copy of your PowerPoint. Let me start off by saying I don't disagree. I can't disagree with the science. It is very clear that our society has been shaped by the automobile. It has been long shaped by the automobile, sometimes in very heinous ways, with the big motor companies buying up trolleys and putting them out of business. I think that the National Highway Program led to a lot of the urban sprawl that we have. I think beltways furthered that. And I think those are undeniable facts, but we are talking about Annapolis, and I couldn't help but notice most of Brooks's examples were Ward 5 urban sprawl examples. And I also couldn't help notice that the darkest blue in his map on revenue generating was actually in Ward 8 in Eastport and downtown. And so I would make that prefacing comment to say this isn't a one size fits all kind of problem, but the legislation is in fact one size fits all. Now I'm going to very quickly hasten to say I'm being urged by a lot of people to try to exempt Ward 8 from this legislation, aside from the fact that that's not doable, according to the city attorney. I don't think it's advisable either. I think that we really do need to find these solutions across the city. The problems I'm having with the legislation is in the very purpose statement. It says the purpose is to remove the parking requirements for off-site. It doesn't tell us why. And so one of the questions that I would put to the sponsors, other than a global ideological reason for doing this, why are we doing this legislation? And why are we doing it in the way that we're doing it? I think that this legislation makes changes that affect us all equally, even though we're not in an equal situation. So I guess my three-part initial question is, why are we doing this legislation? Is this part of a broader sprawl repair? Brooks, you made me buy this $54 book.
Yeah, buddy.
Is it because we want to do outdoor dining? Is it because we want restaurants in the maritime zones? And so I think, in fairness, the sponsors really they owe us more explanation about why we're doing this legislation, why we should do this. Now, I think the legislation is insufficient in three pretty important ways. First of all, if we're going to follow Professor Shoup, we need to follow him all the way. This legislation does step one. Shoup goes on to say, after we eliminate the off-street parking, we need to price on-street parking in a fair way and in a way that is so high that it'll always leave a couple of empty spaces. And then, even more importantly, although I think tougher to do legislatively, Shoup says we need to find ways to share that parking revenue with the very communities that are impacted by that parking revenue, however it's generated, parking districts, parking zones. So if we're going to do this legislation, let's go all the way following Shoup, not just this step one. Secondly, I think the legislation is insufficient in that it only addresses private off-street parking. It doesn't address the other aspects of restaurants, such as ADA requirements for parking, such as the special exception agreements that every one of these restaurants has signed, and that includes parking requirements, but other requirements as well. And then finally, for the, I'm losing my train of thought here. There's one other aspect. Oh, I know, the special exception, and I'm losing it. And then, so we are going to have to think about how we amend the special exceptions. And then, and this is something that was brought forth to me by a business member of my community who spent considerable amount of hours. Brooks, I forwarded your email to us. And by the way, I want to thank you for your openness and candor. That email you sent to me lays it all out, lays where you're going, and you were very clear in there. This is just phase one of multiple future steps. And as you know, I do like the idea of having a seminar with your bibliography. I think that would be a very good exercise for the council. But what this person said is Shoup never once seems to address the impact of this parking on businesses. And I think there's a business pyramid or triad that we need to be worrying about here. The use of off-street parking for outdoor dining not only reduces the amount of available parking, at the same time, it increases the number of customers, most of which, as Brooks correctly points out, are coming by car. Very few of them walk to the restaurant. It also allows more restaurant entrants, further increasing the parking pressure and restaurant competition, albeit that does provide consumer choice, a greater consumer choice, speaking as an economist. The on-street parking space is finite. So we need to look at the spaces we have and then look at the customer requirements for starting with restaurants. But Brooks goes on to say he wants to change the requirements for all commercial space and all residential space. I hear you, and I'm not even disagreeing with you, but I think we do need to look at that. There is a finite supply of parking spaces on street. And so even if we price it high with mobile apps and parking districts, there's only so much to go around. And so the restaurants will, the residents will pressure these higher fees. I'm already seeing that in the work that is being done in Eastport with a joint Eastport Civic Association, Eastport Business Association work group, where they are really looking at these parking zones and how they're going to price those parking zones. Do you get X number of hours free? Probably not. Do
No.
you? No, and I agree with you, Brooks. I
No
don't
one
think
should
it
park.
should. No free riders. And not only that, there's a side benefit. No middies parking over here. No people from Ward 1 parking their extra cars over here. I mean, there's a lot of positive benefits from these parking zones and potentially parking districts. But that higher fee, which Shoup recommends, is going to have an impact on restaurant demand. When you add the parking that you have to pay, as I do every time I use Park Mobile to dine in Washington or Baltimore, I know there's a surcharge for my dining because I'm going to have to pay for that mobile app. And for some, that can become prohibitive. Of course, the price of gasoline is going to become prohibitive for dining in Washington and Baltimore pretty soon. But still, it is going to impact the demand for restaurant. And then if we move it on to commercial and residential, there are going to be profound reallocations. We, as an economist, would say we're going to move to a new equilibrium. And I don't know that we have the research to tell us yet whether that equilibrium is the equilibrium that we want to move to. And this goes beyond just the planning for parking and urban development, or an equilibrium that we're going to find less desirable than the one that we were in basically pre-COVID. I mean, COVID is really what in part kicked this off. It is what alerted to people about how pleasurable outdoor dining is. And talking again with a business restaurant person, the cost of food and the supply chain disruptions and how hard it is to get wait staff is driving up that restaurant's cost. And they can address that in one of two ways. They can increase the price of the food to cover these increased costs, or they can increase volume. And outdoor dining is a way to increase volume. So from a business prospect for those businesses, as long as they can continue to maintain customers, that's a good economic equation. I just don't think we've traced the whole economic domino effect out far enough to see whether that's a winner or a loser for both restaurants and us. I will just say one last thing. I think the city now with the concession agreement is going to be looking at parking revenue as a source to supplement the parking fund, which then supplements the transit fund. And I think there's going to be a strong appetite for these parking districts. I think a strong appetite for significant parking fees in these parking zones. And that again is going to change the equilibrium, supply demand. And I'm not sure I can tell you or anyone else right at the moment. Maybe Eric has this all figured out, how that new equilibrium is going to play out. So I think that I support the overall concept and the idea of not only this, but Brooks's subsequent legislation. But I think we need to implement the full Shoup policy, and we need to be mindful of other unintended consequences if we, by removing parking requirements, encourage a whole bunch of restaurants in the Maritime zone, as Eric started to eliminate. That is even more restaurant competition. It is more consumer choice, but it's also more demand for space, and it's also more pressure on the whole restaurant business enterprise. And I don't know that we know the answers to that. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to, I would encourage the commission to be thinking about and paying attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Arnett. So at this point, let's open it up. I want to go around to the other commissioners, see if they have questions either for Alderman Schnellmeyer or even Alderman Arnett, just probing questions or clarification questions. Who wants to start? Anybody?
I'll just ask a few initial questions, and this is for Brooks or Karma. I actually don't know the status of the parking task force in, I think Eastport, and it's the administration working with the task force. Basically, the administration working with Eastport. Can somebody fill me in on where that is and how that relates to this legislation?
I can.
I do not know the specifics of the current task force. I was only I am aware that they are meeting and working on things after conversations with the Eastport Business Association and the Eastport Civic Association. I am aware of the previous parking and mobility study that was presented in 2016. Alderman Arnett, you seem like you know the specific layout.
Yeah, so I have all three, the traffic study that had the parking utilization analysis, and then the 2018 report. But the status of this new initiative is that tomorrow, with cooperation from David Gerald and Kwaku Dua, the director of the Transportation Department, they're going to be receiving from SP Plus a major data dump that is going to allow them to analyze all of the capabilities of a mobile app. And by the way, SP Plus isn't recommending Park Mobile, they're recommending another one, but apparently there's an even newer Meta parking app, which will allow you to be a member of any one of 5 different parking apps and just use this Meta app and get your parking taken care of. But they're getting a major data dump tomorrow. They are looking to have at least a preliminary report, basically to me, but also to the ECA and EBA by sometime towards the end of April. So it's not moving fast enough for my taste, but by our standards, it's moving along pretty quickly. And there's some pretty good
follow-up
people.
Question to Brooks or Karma would be, does this legislation sort of bypass the task force work, or will it be waiting to see the result of the task force analysis?
It does not bypass or negate anything that the task force is going to be coming forward. I do not believe this kind of ties into the reason why I first introduced this, which was, well, as much as I appreciated the place building of outdoor dining during COVID and the use of better use of spaces for that, the genesis of this was the UN climate change report and how much alarm bells that rang in the scientific community, especially when it came to the biggest contributor to climate change in the United States was car use and how driving increased with parking. So that was my genesis, and I firmly believe during a climate crisis, we cannot wait on other things to take positive steps forward in addressing that. So,
but do you think that the task force, which is made up of, very, very, I guess, people that have been involved in these reports in the past and have studied the issues and live in the area, if in fact that took a few more months, do you think it would have a drastic impact on climate change? In other words, wouldn't it make sense in your mind to let the task force play out, at least for the Eastport sector, because there are just a lot of things that go into that you may miss by moving this legislation too quickly and not taking those issues into account?
An overall difference in the cosmos, who knows, man, nothing significant, but this is something I wish to really push forward. And the reason of that is we are a city that can get prone to paralysis by analysis very frequently, and not moving forward with positive things that we know can improve our environmental situation as soon as possible risks getting things more bogged down and nothing happening.
Oh yeah, I know that. One of the things I noticed in Donald Shoup's book, Let Prices Do the Planning. Actually, this is the section called Let Prices Do the Planning. On page 495, it says removing off-street parking requirements. There's a section that says It's in the middle of the page of 495. If cities remove their parking requirements to eliminate inefficiency, the ratio of parking spaces to people will decline decline or rise more slowly, and parking prices will increase, of course. Parking requirements cannot be eliminated all at once, of course. Instead, cities can dismantle their parking requirements gradually. So would you kind of agree with Donald Shoup on that?
I would, and that's actually why this is partially separated out. And the larger bill that I'm working on is a little bit more measured, though you could argue, but it is still pretty drastic in overall parking reductions. Just to kind of give you a snapshot, at bare minimum, it cuts them in half. Now,
So are there others that have additional questions? So let's just I want to make sure everybody
Yeah,
has
sure.
a chance to.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Alex, if I could quickly respond to Diane's question, though. I think in most wards, most restaurants, if not all, are in strip malls. And it's not until Brooks's step 2, whatever that may be, that we'll see much change there. I think it's only going to be in the highly dense, very urban areas like Ward 1, Ward 2, and Ward 8. I don't think that Grapes not having a parking requirement is going to change the clock tower parking lot one whit. Phase 2 of your legislation, Brooks, might do that, but not this legislation.
All right,
actually,
so
during the original state of emergency, a couple restaurants in the more strip mall-y areas were able to significantly take advantage of this increased capacity. Grapes Wine Bar was able to expand out onto the parking lot of the Clock Tower Plaza very effectively away from its tiny space and their little patio, able to spread out even more. Grumps, which has luckily been able to put up its tent, even though it's in a parking lot. I've enjoyed many an outdoor brunch at the Dining Grumps. And then Main and Market was also another strip mall based restaurant that was able to take advantage of this. These things can provide flexibility even to these other spaces. And it also, if spaces in these strip malls open up, gives additional flexibility for new restaurants or new things to come in at a faster period. The wider legislation that I'm going to be coming out with that's more commercial focused as well, I hope will have bigger impacts on things like retail, especially in regards to things like grocery stores and clothing and things of that nature. But it is one of those things where every step or every journey has to have a first step. We can hem and haw and try to figure out like, oh, should we wait for this? Should we wait for this? Should we wait for this? And we will get caught up in the traditional Annapolis pattern of paralysis by analysis and do nothing when the UN climate change report is ringing the alarm bell saying, we need to start doing things now.
No, I would agree with
Okay.
that. I just wanted to just say that in some of the parts of the city, there's already great walkability, and we already have tackled, we do shared parking in a lot of the places, especially around 4th Street and in Eastport. So yeah, there's a cookie cutter approach that might not work here, but I do appreciate your, the urgency in, in your passion about this as well. So thank you for that.
Okay, who else has questions? Want to take the floor?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So, Mr. Arnett, so we saw the success of the dining downtown during COVID, and everybody seemed to enjoy that. And it seemed like everybody found a way to get there. What you seem to be on board with it, but what are the negative things you're hearing from the restaurateurs in Eastport?
Well, some restaurants don't have, like, for example, Davis's have been denied having increase in outdoor dining. Remember, under the recovery zones, they were allowed to close 4th Street and expand their outdoor dining. Luna's has never had any parking. Many of the restaurants in Eastport don't have enough, even with shared parking, enough parking space. So, but there are other things, as I alluded earlier, there's other things that restaurants have to do. And the part that I forgot about is these tents, with some of which I think are hideous, are subject to accessory structure code. and they're going to need to be permitted. I've told Franyo, I hate his dirty white tents. I think that
Yeah,
it's
but that's
ugly.
that's not really,
Well, wait a minute. There's
that's
more.
not really related to this issue.
Well, it is related in the sense that Brooks is bringing up the environment. So we made the boatyard have a permeable parking lot, and now we're covering it with a tent. So, I mean, if we're going to be bringing in environment into our thinking, let's think about having more impermeable space, which is what a tent in effect brings. So those are things that I think are going to have to be addressed in repairing all of the legislation, even if 0922 passes as is.
When it comes to establishments like Davis Pub or Lunis, places that I absolutely love, especially Lunis, it's where I dined before proposing to my wife. They do not benefit directly from 0922, but they also aren't burdened with parking requirements already, which, as I showed previously in that EPA study, can add significant costs annually to businesses due to maintenance and potential lost revenue. Davis, when expanded into the recovery zone, was expanding into public streets and therefore took actual space away from the city, but establishments like Rumps setting up their tents in the parking lot of a private structure isn't taking anything away from city property. So while I understand they may act like this is preferential treatment, by not having their own parking lots, they are saving significant costs overall and have a bit of an advantage with the current playing field.
Yeah. So I have a
Have
question.
you looked at the mayor's amendment? They will be paying a fee. Yeah. So they will be paying a fee.
They will.
Okay. Anyway, but that's again neither here nor there for this discussion. But so I have a question, and it's really just a clarification. And so there's nothing in this legislation that prevents a restaurateur from building their own parking, correct?
No. If they think that that parking lot is more essential to their business than expanded capacity, they are more than welcome to keep the parking.
Right. So if it's essentially part of, if they have a type of restaurant that has a business model that caters to, people who are arriving in cars, they can provide as much parking as they want. They're just not required to provide it, correct? Yeah.
Correct. To use a local favorite of mine, El Cabrito, if El Cabrito wishes to keep their few parking spaces and not add capacity because they believe that that is more advantageous to their business, they are more than welcome to. However, if they believe that expanding out capacity is more advantageous and they believe that their customers will figure out a way to get there, that is their choice as well. This is a bit of an entrepreneurial empowerment bill, I can argue.
And do you think, what other unintended consequences can you see about the types of restaurants that might happen if they elect not to have any parking, not to provide any?
Types of restaurants, I frankly do not know. I think many restaurants can benefit from various types can benefit. If something wants to be a classic walk-up established snack shack style stand, they can benefit by not having parking and taking advantage of the traditional nostalgia of just going up to the seaside shack and grabbing your thing and walking off and eating at a picnic table. If a formal upscale restaurant wants to have a larger space, then they're more than welcome to do that too. It can benefit restaurants of all kinds.
Right. So if you wanted to say cater to be a neighborhood place that caters to people who are all in the 4 or 5 block area, and you can make a business at that, it would essentially cater to people who are local, for example. Yeah.
The only thing I would see this hurting is things that rely on the drive-through. But again, if it's used to develop that way, this bill will not prevent that.
Right. Well, that's another story. I think the city should ban drive-throughs, but that's
me too.
Neither here nor there for this discussion. Okay, so I've asked a couple questions. Bob, David, Teresa, you have,
I believe Alderwoman O'Neill, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, had
Ah.
something. to
oh,
add.
yeah, sorry. Yep. Go ahead.
Actually, I think Teresa had her hand up first.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think you addressed my question. A lot of the discussion has been about temporary structures, additional structures for expanding outdoor dining. But I had a question about future development on existing sites. So if we look at, let's say the example you gave on where Chick-fil-A is, how would this affect, from that developer continuing to develop on that parking lot, multiple restaurants, multiple drive-throughs? This would now be allowed going forward, yes?
If they wish to build multiple restaurants with multiple drive-throughs, this legislation would not prevent that, but I've shared my feelings on drive-throughs.
But other code would have to be followed. You'd
Other
be
code
building
would
a
need
new
to be
structure.
followed.
Of course. I just wanted to make sure that this was, I knew this legislation going forward, but I wanted to understand how it would affect existing structures on, that development lot, and if that would prevent them from repurposing the parking lot in any way they see fit, as long as it aligns with this new legislation.
Well, if anything, this legislation would give more empowerment for people to repurpose their parking lot, because it takes away the old rigid code that said you must do it this way if your building is this large and you need this many spaces. So this legislation would increase the amount of flexibility, and the subsequent legislation that I am working on is also going to increase flexibility overall. And by giving that, we open up and unlock the economic potential of current strip mall places if they wish to retrofit some of their areas or expand some of their areas in their existing footprint, or two, for any redevelopment potential that may come along. Like, let's say big box stores, we all know, are dying, and that is the trend, and a new developer comes in and wants to turn that one plaza into mixed use residential retail restaurants. It would give them a lot more flexibility with their overall space that wouldn't have to be dominated by a big old chunk of asphalt.
Thank you.
Yeah, Karma, go ahead.
Sure. So a couple things that I've been trying to observe and listen and talking with different people, and the council has received to date 94 testimonials from people in the community in support of the legislation. And I looking at it from an outside perspective, I don't drive to Lunis's knowing that they have 30% parking spaces allotted to them. Maybe they fall outside of that. I don't drive to someplace in my mind knowing that there's going to be parking for at least 30% of the people that are going to arrive there. I drive to a restaurant because I want to go there, or I've heard about it. It's been, talked up, and I find parking. And I understand that Eastport is really concerned about more and more people coming and parking. And on the one hand, that's a really great thing because we're getting more popular and people are, finding out about the restaurants and it's booming the restaurants, right? But at the same time, we also have to look at, I lived in Eastport for 4 years and I knew what it was like coming home and having to park 4 blocks away from my house. And that's where Eastport really needs to push to perhaps a zoned parking plan to protect their residents at the same time enhancing their businesses. So if I'm just driving to Eastport because I want to find a restaurant for the night, and if I go to a restaurant like O'Leary's that has a parking lot and it's full, I'm probably not going to choose there anyway because it's full and the wait might be too long. So I'm going to park someplace and find the restaurant that I would decide to go to. That's just kind of the layman's ideology for this whole thing. Like, the general public doesn't know that there's a percentage of parking available at these restaurants. And if we can move towards, as Brooke says, move towards less reliance on the cars and the vehicles, again, we can look more at enhancing our transportation system and our the way we move people around the city and from the outskirts of the city in.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Change.
Yep, thanks. Bob, go ahead.
Well, first I want to thank Brooks and Karma for bringing this thing to the fore. it made me do two things. One, it made me read many more words of this fellow Shoup than I ever thought I would.
Hooray.
And secondly, it made me think back on all of the decisions that we've made as a planning commission when we've said, oh, you've got a parking requirement, you've got to put in this, or you've got to put in that. And I could think of, one example is that, what is it? It's row houses now on Giddings Avenue and Ridgely. And they have whatever they have, 4 or 6, I can't remember the number of parking spaces on the side, when there's parking all up and down Giddings and Ridgely. And they could have put in another unit. So I was thinking about them the many times, and we've said, oh, there's a parking requirement. And sometimes it's worked, I think, to better planning advantage, and sometimes it's worked to a disadvantage. But in any case, I want to thank Brooks and Karma for pushing this to the front, even as we look back on the mistakes we've made in the past, and making us think newly about these things. But here are my comments. First of all, I don't think that there would be a conflict with any plans that Eastport comes up with for a zoned parking in which residents get the advantage, and it may push restaurant customers elsewhere. But as part of the whole Eastport planning process, they're going to be looking at surface and under building parking that needs to be made better use of. So I tend to agree with Brooks that this will not necessarily conflict with what Eastport wants to do. But I also agree with Ross to some extent, in that if we're going to do this, we need to be thinking about going all the way with some of these things. And that might be that there are parking meters all over town, or all over places where there's parking pressure. And that getting ready for sophisticated demand pricing and all of that Shoup talks about, may come to pass, and that needs to be contemplated, at the very least, if not made a part of the legislation. So I think also that Ross is right when he said, it's a big piece of legislation that tends to just look at everything with the same perspective. Oh, let's do away with it all everywhere. Where we might, not necessarily, but we might begin to look at the differences in places like Eastport, which is quite dense, West Annapolis commercial area, which is a very different kind of an area, purely residential areas like Germantown, Homewood, which I'm very familiar with, and downtown, and then the strip center, our strip city, strip mall, whatever you call them, Center City, the Forest Drive corridor all the way out to Route 2. And by the way, I don't think that Chick-fil-A is within city limits.
It is.
It is?
Yes.
Because the dividing line is down the middle of that strip center behind the marijuana dealer. They're not in the city.
The marijuana dealer or dispensary, I believe they like to be called. Dealer has a different connotation, is basically carved out of the city, but then the city line itself is Route 2.
Well, I recall a big diagonal, but so what? Okay, it is what it is. But I'm wondering if what else needs to be contemplated to deal with these different situations. For instance, if in the strip centers, or especially the Bay Ridge Giant Center, which is
one of the worst,
which is just waiting for something here, okay? In the next 10 years, something's going to happen, and all kinds of things could happen. We need to be prepared to either allow or prohibit that, edge development, or what we're going to be requiring in a big place like that, or what we can allow the strip centers to do. Now, what Brooks is proposing is a purely market dynamic in which, if El Cabrito wants to do this, let El Cabrito try it and see what happens. If we raise the prices for parking on the street in Eastport, until 9 o'clock at night, and if we make it prohibitive, well, they'll find valet parking, or they'll park under the city marina, or they'll go wherever they go. So you're proposing a real market-oriented thing, and I'm trying to think of what it is the city needs to be prepared to allow or not allow in these different situations. I think, for instance, as the West Annapolis master plan over there gets doing, they need to think about parking. And I know that EMR, or whatever they're called, wants to do a parking garage. I don't know the facts, but I just know that this legislation could change things drastically over there. And they're thinking there might be parking meters all up and down Annapolis Street. It's okay, be fine. The unintended consequence, the only one that's been raised as an unintended consequence that gives me concern is that by reducing any kind of a parking requirement, that there will inevitably be more pressure to put restaurants in these maritime zones. And that does have an unintended consequence. And I don't know what the solution is to that, because they're two very different values, clashing with that one. And I think we need to acknowledge that we frankly limited restaurants in MRE, which is the main place where the pressure is going to be, by requiring some parking equation, whatever that factor was. So I think that Ross is right. That is a consequence that I think needs to be contemplated. And I don't know if the legislation gets refashioned or what.
I have several responses for the several great points that you brought up. First, I am glad that reading Donald Shoup has made you go, oh man, this could have put one more home in a location, but we had to save it for parking, which is precisely what parking requirements do. They limit our housing stock overall, and that's why we have a housing shortage and a housing cost crisis. So it's okay, everybody made mistakes in the past, and we reached Shoup, and that's great. In regards to the maritime zoning districts, two things. One, we're kind of admitting that we're using parking requirements as a tool to kind of limit the city's potential by stopping any kind of change or flexibility. And I do think that's telling. And in regards to the maritime zoning districts, by limiting the rigidness of space, which is going to be coming for other types of commercial properties, which is coming with more legislation that I'm working on, we will still be able to give those maritime businesses themselves the flexibility to grow and adjust and limit their own costs and their own ability to operate. It's usually a collective good when you give a space more flexibility to change with the market itself. The one size fits all criticism that has been brought up, I will say that the parking requirements as a whole were applied with a one size fits all based upon a numerical pseudoscience that no one is really able to explain why we've assigned these different things. And the reason why historic parts of West Annapolis, parts of Eastport look the way they do is citizens were not willing to tear down businesses or buildings to accommodate them. So they were more able to use skilled negotiations for special exceptions. So by limiting the playing field overall for these other groups, we give these other neighborhoods the potential to start looking more like these financially productive places. And we keep these financially productive places from looking more like the less financially productive ones when any kind of change comes and a new business isn't able to get the skilled development lawyer and get the special exception. You brought up another thing, and I'm blanking on it. The free market solutions and all these other things. I am a very big believer in free market solutions because we have the auto industry basically presenting its car use is kind of a free market thing on its own, but we have subsidized either as the city providing free curbside spaces or required businesses and developers to subsidize automobile ownership. And parking is the only thing with car ownership that we do. Cars need more things than parking. They need repair places, they need gas stations, but we don't put an ordinance in saying, okay, the city needs to have this many gas stations, so our cars are, we only do it with parking. So it's an interesting thing. And I think if we are going to have privately owned automobiles, the owners of those private automobiles need to be responsible for figuring out what to do when they're not using it.
Okay, I get that. I get that. And I get that. And I'm not disagreeing with you in general, and that's why, Shoup's stuff is so persuasive. I mean, it's incredibly logical. But I do want to go back to something that's very Annapolis specific. And when you said that we would be limiting the city's potential by sort of limiting the number of restaurants in the maritime zones, you remember if you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, then you're in trouble. And so I don't know that you're limiting the city's potential by permitting restaurants free, whoever wants to try their hand at it in MRE. And I think the city's potential as a maritime center is a very important value and goal to be looked at. So it may be that there's some special considerations in some special zones.
I was making that point as parking requirements as a whole, not specific for.
But you said it specifically related to the the maritime zone.
I meant it in referring to the wider goals of reducing parking requirements.
Okay, well, I'll be able to talk on that level. We do have a wider goal of protecting, it's a very important engine in this city. Maybe it's an outboard motor or an inboard engine or whatever the metaphor you want to make, but it's a very important,
it's electric.
It's a very important dynamic in this city. And we've got, as what I learned in this maritime zoning task force is how important it is to protect it. And yet there still may be some flexibilities there. I'm cautioning that we may need to look at some of these things, specifically.
Yeah, so
and I'd like to add to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts about that. That the thing that's interesting about this legislation is it's on its face, it's very, very simple. It doesn't have it just says this: you don't require any parking. And I think especially with respect to something like the maritime zones, and you hit it. I don't remember who said it, but the fact that we're essentially limiting, we're trying to protect the maritime zones by applying parking requirements it's the wrong way. If we want to prevent restaurants to take over the maritime zones, let's do that explicitly. Don't do it implicitly by parking requirements. And that's part of, and this leads to a bigger issue with some of the stuff that Ross said, is that, and I think also Bob mentioned it, is that I think we want to be careful not to wrap any parking policy in with this legislation, because while clearly they're related, and if you've read anything about Shoup's book, you'll know they're related. But to start to say, well, we can reduce minimum parking requirements if we have this other set of Byzantine requirements about how we manage parking, we haven't gained anything. We've just sort of shifted the cups around, and we just still have a mess. And I think there's nothing that prevents the city from managing its parking policy completely as essentially a dependent variable in this. So if you were to pass this legislation and get rid of minimum parking requirements, first of all, we aren't going to have 100 restaurants the day after a legislation like this is passed. I mean, it's going to take some time, for things to sort of slowly change. And I think the city can then start to adjust parking policy to deal with the consequences of a change like this, a very simple, at least legislative change, and deal with those consequences as they happen, versus saying, well, I think this is going to, X, Y, and Z are going to happen due to this legislation. So we got to wrap in all this other stuff about parking into the legislation because we think this is, we think X, Y, Z is going to happen. I think it's important to keep this simple and then think about policies later that could be applied very specifically to different areas to deal with the fact that Eastport is not West Annapolis, is not downtown, is not Ward 5. But I think if you try to come up with this uber solution in wrapping parking to deal with all those different areas, you're just going to tie a Gordian knot that you're never going to get out of. And so adjusting the parking policy that frankly doesn't need to be in the legislation. I think it's nuts that to change a parking zone, we have to change a law. That should all be done through an administrative process, in my opinion. And if that were, you could better adjust, as Shoup says, adjust based on the pressures on the ground, because it's kind of like a balloon that's filled with water. You squeeze it one place, it pops in another place. So you need to maintain some flexibility to adjust that policy. And I think doing that in a different way and not wrapping it in with this legislation, like I said, that's very simple. That just says you're not going to require a business to have a certain amount of parking spots that makes sense.
If I may, Alex,
So,
very briefly, if I may,
Yep.
I think you're right. And if I understand you, what you're saying is something, if I can get concrete, what you're saying is that Eastport and its plan, they could institute all kinds of things if they wish.
Yes.
They could institute
Yes.
meters. They could institute a zone. They could institute
They should have been
And that's
doing
what I meant when I said that I don't think that this legislation would conflict with
Right.
whatever the
I agree
Eastport study is.
100%.
Okay.
Yep. And
Well, and
frankly,
there is-
some sort of managed parking in Eastport is a long time overdue, and I just don't know why it hasn't happened. That Will Small was talking about it 10 years ago when I was on the transportation board, and
Well, we tried.
nothing has happened.
Yeah, I
So-
was on the Civic Association for a while, and
Yeah.
it was interesting. We tried
So-
really hard in 2016 to get this done, but the city pushed back and said no. And at the time, there was this pushback. We couldn't get even simple things done. We just wanted a sign that indicated you could park at Annapolis City Marina. That was public parking. The list of things that were identified as solutions that would help alleviate some of the pressure were just ignored. So it's not because the Civic Association didn't try. There's been a big push for quite a while.
The way our parking being is legislative action, that requires a legislator to make that initiative.
Oh, no, I don't disagree. And I do like the simplicity of having, a law that says, okay, it's spelled out very easy, and then don't try to make exceptions right away. But I would say, in the case, I was glad that Brooks showed the picture of the American planning blue-green zones, and pointing out that those areas that have high value, like Eastport and Ward 1, we subsidize all those suburban neighborhoods. And, especially Alex, you've read Joe Minicozy and you've been to the webinars. We have so much value in Eastport and in Ward 1. We actually are implementing a lot of the policies around parking that are being advocated here. So, back to Bob's point about let's not kill the goose that laid the golden egg. We are on a peninsula. So if we just opened it up right now and said no more parking requirements for any place on Eastport Peninsula, let's just limit it between 6th Street down to where SSA is. If we really did have no exceptions for Maritime, we would lose our Maritime in a heartbeat, because there are already owners, as we know from the Maritime Task Force testimony, that would much rather turn their property into restaurants than useful Maritime. And we want to retain Maritime, as
And
Bob said.
the maritime legislation should say that. Don't
Well,
back,
we just
don't
lost,
back,
we added so much flexibility on the left.
but don't backdoor it.
Maritime
Don't backdoor it using parking
Well,
requirements.
we have, I'm trying to figure out another way to do it. When we fought really hard in the task force to preserve Maritime, and we already added so much flexibility that, we had our boat in Annapolis Harbor Boatyard. We had to get it out because they were going to do a wedding there. And they did the first wedding, and they had to get 30 or maybe 25 boats out of the way for that. And it's like, I could see that financial impact of doing a wedding in a parking lot in Yacht Haven is going to outweigh the Maritime business, and we're going to lose it. We're going to be sorry, because once it's gone, it's gone. So I'm just saying that it's very important that we look at this not in a in a cookie cutter way, especially because we're doing so well following the Strong Towns policies and Joe Minicozzi's theories on the value of property. And so my point is, I do think there's some ways to look at this that we have to consider going forward.
So other commissioners, do you have comments or questions before I see Ross has his hand back up, but I want to give everybody else a chance.
Ross.
I'll give you my input. I really applaud Alderman Brooks Schinnemeyer and Ms. and Alderman O'Neill for bringing this forward. I think the environmental aspect is something we definitely need to look at, and I'm concerned, about the implementation of it for a lot of the reasons that Alderman Arnett spoke of, the one size fits all, and I don't totally agree with the whole idea that that transportation is a moot point. I know that the transportation in our city right now is public transportation is pretty dreadful. And I doubt that anybody here really uses it on a regular basis. I try to, but it's really dreadful, and I wouldn't recommend it. No offense to anybody on YouTube, but we have to say, I think that we need to go a step further, and I want to see more electric cars. Electric cars need parking, for example. Electric cars need to park. I am concerned about the business aspects, not just for restaurants, but other businesses as well. And where that, that we have to keep them in mind as well. So there's a lot to think about here, where we go. So thank you.
I have many thoughts on electric cars and people saying that they're going to save us all.
Thank you, me too. But let's not go there, because we'll be here till midnight.
If I could do a quick response on that though, sure. And go. Electric cars, while they are better than internal combustion engine cars, will not save us, because they are still cars. They still take up the same amount of land. They still require the same amount of infrastructure, of impervious surface, of dead seas of asphalt as a gas guzzler does. And they're also not going to be economically feasible for normal middle class to working class people for a very long time.
And to solve the geometry problem.
Yeah. And so what is infinitely better than keeping our car infrastructure for electric cars is doing things that can actually promote transit, promote walking and biking. And these are done by policy choices from the city. When we prioritize this sprawled out, spread out thing that we currently have as our development pattern in the majority of the city area, we can't get any kind of effective transportation, because we're just treating it as a giveaway to the poors, a feel good, look at what we do and all these things that we offer, not as an actual mobility solution. By making things more difficult for automobiles, we then go, we are now prioritizing alternative mobility solutions to getting around, and then we start actually treating our transit solutions seriously and not as a back burner thing.
but where's the pain point for people to start using public transportation? And at what point do we have an adequate public transportation system in place? Because right now we're very far from an adequate public transportation system, very far. And I don't see that
That's
happening.
it's a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah. And I was interested in Karma's idea because, maybe not having Hillman and then having, restaurants not have any parking requirements will force people to take transit. And maybe that will force our city to somehow, increase or build up our transit, because right now I agree with David. It's not doing, it's not a great system.
Okay, Ross, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
Thank you. So very quickly, first of all, Alex, I agree. We can't rush to the worst case scenario. We can't assume pass this legislation today and tomorrow there's going to be 10 new restaurants. That's just not the way things work.
Right, like ADUs, we're going to be saturating ADUs immediately.
Or short-term rentals, same thing.
So
I do think, though, that we do have a couple of conflicting planning goals. The reason we have maritime zones is expressly because we did not want the maritime places to be crowded out by apartments, residences, offices, and restaurants. It's right in the legislation. And we just went through a huge exercise, passed big changes in the code. And I think that it does need to have some primacy right along with changing parking policies. I think that this one-size-all situation can be thought of in the same way we're thinking about form-based zoning. I think we're initially thinking about doing form-based zoning where the sprawl exists. Forest Drive, Ward 4, Ward 5. That's where the sprawl is. Brooks's pictures showed the sprawl. So I'm not sure that
we're talking about that in West Annapolis, especially.
Pardon me?
We're talking about the form-based zoning in West Annapolis. So
well,
I don't know
think
that conclusion.
We're talking about applying it in places not across the board. It's not a one size fits all.
Right.
And I think we are looking at applying it where there is clearly sprawl and clearly opportunities to have better use of the land. So I think that is a very important thing to think about when we think about the one size fits all. I don't know how that gets applied in legislation, but I don't know how we're applying it in the comp plan yet either. So those are just some quick responses.
Karma?
Sure. I just had a couple of quick responses, mainly to David, and I appreciate the fact that you say that the current public transportation, for lack of a better word, bites the dust. And that's one of the goals that I had coming on boards. And I am lucky enough to happen to be chairing the transportation committee for the city. And that is one of the things that we want to do, and consistency is a key. The biggest problem with our current transportation, the circulator, is the lack of consistency. I would use it. I live in Emerald Heights. When it first started, I used it a few times to go downtown. It was awesome. Took my little kids. They loved getting on and off the bus. And then one time we got stuck downtown for an hour and a half when the bus never came by. And that was kind of the end of it. I was like, I'm done. But one of the things that we want to prove, and given the next 14 to 16 months while the garage is down, we're really working on those 10-minute trolleys. And I'm hoping it's not just a pipe dream. They're 10-minute circulators that will circle throughout, 3 different circles throughout the city, taking people from place to place and getting them downtown. And it's going to mean partnerships with people and convincing people. I went to a chamber lunch today at the Annapolis waterfront, and 2 of the people that were there had taken the circulator down from Westgate Circle, and they were talking about how they take it all the time because they just love it. And I said, well, is it consistent? And they said, fairly consistent, enough to get us around town, and we're not having to drive. We can park at Park Place where we work, and then we can get downtown really easy. So we want to work on those. And I think this is a prime opportunity for us to start pushing forward. We fund a transportation and a transit system. And is it really working? do we continue to fund it and make it work?
Yeah, and I'm not that concerned about the circulator. For a long time, I thought the circulator wasn't running anymore because I find myself walking all the way from down at the Eastport Bridge all the way up to West Street without it coming by. I mean, I thought it for a while there wasn't working when we were discussing that before. But I was more concerned about, like, I live down by the Giant, the infamous Giant. I can't go anywhere on a public bus from there. It would take me an hour and a half to get anywhere on that public bus, and I've tried it. It doesn't even take me to the park and ride over off of Riva Road without having to walk a while. So it's not worth doing, and nobody does it for the most part. People don't do it, and it's not a feasible thing. Now, I consider Admiral Heights downtown. I consider West Street downtown. I consider West Annapolis downtown. I'm talking about outside of downtown.
Yeah.
Is where my concern was.
Right. And those are the things that we need to work on, right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying, is that 10 years down the road? And what's the pain point for people to get to start using public transportation?
Well,
I
And
think
in a perfect world, what's the pain
as
point?
someone who commutes via public transportation previously every single day or 5 days a week, and now anytime I have to go into Washington, which actually made me late for a planning commission meeting on some other thing. I don't quite remember what.
I remember.
The reason that I don't drive into DC, even though I have to get all the way to the Truman Park and Ride for catching that bus, is I know parking in DC sucks, to put it mildly. It's expensive, and it's expensive. If I want it to be convenient, and if I want it to be cheap, it's inconvenient.
I take the Dillon bus every day myself. I
it's-
understand.
It's terrible. I hate the S schedule. Bring back the 15-minute one. But anyway, the reason that I do that, though, is because I know driving into DC is really inconvenient.
Mhm.
When we make things a little bit more convenient for other mobility things, such as like walking and biking, and a little harder for driving, people will drive less.
Again, it's the pain point. You and I are both people who will take public transportation. I have no problem taking transportation. I do it every day, but I won't do it locally in Annapolis unless I really, really have to. And for me not doing it, I know that a lot of people have less inclination to do it than I do.
Well, people make rational choices as to what's in their best interest, either time or money. And unfortunately, because what of the policies we've put in place, generally the rational choice is to drive.
Could I
So, Bob, go ahead. Yep.
I think two quick things. First of all, I think that part of transportation is going to be entrepreneurs, private guys, and running a shuttle from, I don't know, from Eastport out to the Bay Ridge Giant and back. Those kinds of things that the city shouldn't be running, but the city should be simply, overseeing, regulating, and making sure that they run well. So not only our government supported transportation system, but also private transportation systems, I think will, once the pain point is reached, will spring up. But the other thing I wanted to just toss out at this late hour is, what other kinds of enabling legislation may be in the offing as a result of this large policy push? For instance, what would need to be done to allow people to reconfigure their parking lots and build things? The Hillsmere Shopping Center is an easy one because it would be, a planned unit development, big mixed use planned unit development, and all kinds of flexibilities are there. But for some of these smaller centers where there's some room, where this notion of putting an edge of residences alongside the avenue or the boulevard was really kind of appealing to me at first glance in what's his name's book. And so what kinds of enabling legislation would need to be thought of and conceived of even at this point?
Part of it, again, is increasing flexibility for these spaces overall. As I said previously, this was originally part of a much bigger bill that I was writing, but I thought that the bigger bill was still needing working on, and this was something small and simple that I think a lot of people in the city kind of understood the implications of here and there. And this was kind of my way to get people understanding like these parking requirements are hurtful and for our city overall and damage community spaces. What I would say, if we want to increase the flexibility and start doing more mixed use, start allowing more kind of housing, it's going to require a reduction and or elimination of parking requirements for homes, especially multifamily ones. That is something that I have not started yet. It is something that I am going to be working on within a year or two, probably within a year.
What are the other steps in the parking strategy of yours? What are,
The next, I'm sorry, I stepped on your question.
oh, go on. No, I asked the question.
The next one, which is much closer to being done by the nature of I at least have a very rough draft written, is overall commercial requirements. Kind of the bedrock of that is the current starting point that I have is I just cut the numbers in half. The numbers that were originally there are arbitrary. No one can really point to the scientific reason why. So my new numbers were arbitrary too, but they cut them in half, and that's what I considered a good start. As I've done more research and as I've seen, apparently there is a bigger appetite for going full Donald Shoup than I thought. Maybe we'll go outright elimination for some of them. Maybe we'll just scale them back even more and try to implement actual paid parking on more public streets. I am now kind of excited about this, and it's frankly why I'm glad I split this off, because who knew so many in the commission loved Shoup.
Okay, let me point out another potential piece of enabling legislation if you're going to continue down this road, and that is to enable the funds from parking that are raised at the meters to be spent in specific ways, to be earmarked. Okay.
Transit, what I had in mind is one, transportation, and the other community repair, such as fixing sidewalks, implementing street tree planting so that we can actually kind of slow down cars and continue the walkability of neighborhoods by providing nice shade and protection for pedestrians from stray cars that go off road. And the other big goal that I had was depaving incentives, so that if there's a big shopping center that isn't slated for full-on redevelopment, but they get enough incentive carrot and stick to maybe tear up a chunk of unused asphalt for them to put in something that is actually beneficial to the community. Trees, parks, housing, possibilities are limitless of what we can do if we give these flexibilities up. Now, the overall deep paving initiatives, that is the farthest out in the pipe dream, but I'm not letting getting everything lined up perfect to get in the way of good of a positive step. I am trying to schedule a meeting with someone who founded an organization called Deep Pave Chicago, which had some success in tearing up pavement in the Chicago area and building better community spaces there. And these little small steps here and there, these little small implementation things here and there will give our city flexibility to kind of become a more resilient place, to offer more amenities to the families that live here, better community benefits to families that are here and families that are moving here, and just grow in a more organic, sustainable way.
So along the lines
Diane,
of what
go ahead.
Bob
Yeah.
just said, I just wanted to chime in and agree that, having enabling legislation that works with this is important. And one of the things that, Shoup talks about as being a key step is to share the revenue that's generated from any, parking system, if we're going to do paid parking, with the communities that are impacted. So in Eastport, we have to have something that puts the money back into Eastport if we're raising money through a paid parking system. And so did you, and I'll have to look at the legislation again, but was there anything in your legislation that talks about how that step works?
Not in the one that is currently introduced. And part of the wider legislation, I was starting the process of figuring out what to do, how to implement any kind of paid parking system. This is again why I carved off a very small piece of this that I thought was ready for the prime time while I'm working on the other one, because again, I don't want perfect to get in the way of a good positive step.
Well, one thing I would say is just because there's already a task force working on this very issue, it might make sense to get their enabling legislation or things that they think coincide well with these initiatives. I think that's a great idea. And so hopefully that will happen, because like, I agree that Shoop's ideas are so strong, and I support them, but you can't just take the ones you like randomly. I think sharing the revenue with the communities impacted is a key step, and I don't think you just leave that off. So hopefully you can either revise it and add it to your legislation, or allow the task force to come up with those steps and, add it to the legislation. That would work pretty well.
Eric Lashinsky,
Okay.
you think there's any way to determine the properties in the city that now have parking lots that, might be modifiable by this?
You
I mean,
mean,
there really aren't that many.
you mean to support infill redevelopment?
Yeah, on their parking lots.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or
really,
lots-
you could almost count them on your fingers.
Without
lots that
you mean
can't
without
be developed.
altering?
Huh?
Either that or lots that it can't be developed because of parking requirements. For example, the space at the corner of West Street and Colonial, that's next to Lemongrass,
Mhm.
that's a classic example. It's just not big enough to support its own parking.
But it has a parking garage there.
Right, but we still make it have minimum parking requirements. That's why there's nothing on it. So it's
And that's part of the reason why I am kind of pushing for the one size fits all solution to what I see as a one size fits all problem that was forced upon these other spaces. These smaller areas, if they want to get developed or redeveloped or change their use, they have to either be very good at arguing themselves or hire the right development lawyer to push it through. They don't just have the ability to come in themselves. And so they either can't do it, or they build a place that's not able to actually sustain itself and goes under because they have to put so much dead space out there.
And again, your legislation is very simple. And a lot of what I'm hearing here that worries me is we're trying to make it really complicated by trying to legislate the solutions to the consequences, where that should be something separate. For example, dealing with parking requirement, or with how you manage on-street parking. That shouldn't be in this legislation. This legislation just says there's no minimum parking off-site or on-site parking requirements, and that every area could deal with the consequences in the way that suits that context. And so it's while it's said that just eliminating the minimum parking requirements is a one size fits all, that is true, but dealing with the consequences of that is not one size fits all. And I think there's lots of flexibility that could happen through parking policy, on-street parking policy, and other things too.
Well, it's been a good discussion.
So, yeah, I was going to say we're close to 2 hours, and if there's no other questions, Brooks, if you want to just have any final thoughts.
I am shocked by how many fans of Donald Shoup there are in this room, and that actually makes me excited for the bigger legislation, because I might go bolder now and try to do the full Shoup. But hey, I appreciate everybody hearing me out. I am glad that we have started this conversation, and we'll be moving forward with this, because if Annapolis is going to be the green, sustainable city that we all want it to be, it is going to require some of these, what may seem more outside the box thinking, to actually reduce our overall carbon footprint. So thanks, guys, and woohoo.
Thanks. Anything else from the commission members or staff? Final words?
No, just
He's got me reading more books than
Yeah, I have.
Did you also? I was bugging Tom by email to get these books, and
it's like going back to school.
Why are you?
I'll put around that.
Yes.
City rules.
Those were the two I suggested to him first.
Fantastic. And it's unfortunate Jeff Speck's speaking fees are, because he's so talented, they're in the order of 5 figures. Unfortunately, that's way too rich for us. But boy, if we could get him to come do a walkability analysis,
I know. That's what we wanted to do for the comp plan. Wouldn't that have been great? And a property value.
he's really expensive though. Anyway,
The overall property
Alrighty.
value, just something, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but this is just a general FYI.
everybody's
map that I
frozen but me.
I'm sorry?
The map.
Oh,
map.
yeah, so the map thing that I showed with like property values overall. So there's a company called Urban 3 that
Yeah, that's what I was
produces that.
talking about.
Yeah, so I've reached out to Urban 3 today, and the map that was put together by a member of the American Planning Association, he's an Annapolis resident, he doesn't have the expenditures and all these other details. So I've actually reached out to Urban 3 to talk about overall costs. And a goal of mine is going to be to either get directly in the budget or an amendment to the budget to do that outward. In addition, showing revenue that the city's receiving, also showing expenditures that the city's putting in.
We tried to do that once with the comp plan, and it was pretty expensive to get U3 to do that analysis. But Eric Lashinsky has done a little bit of that, and he's got some graphics that do it.
Huh, cool.
Well, you may be selling it more, but I
Eric, we'll talk.
I don't have anything
offline.
that compares to what Urban 3 does, but I can definitely vouch for their work. It's pretty impressive, and it would be great to have them do an analysis here.
I mean, you got someone who's actively trying to get it now. There's our key difference. But
No, we
we'll
weren't
talk
active.
offline
We
about it.
didn't really try.
I mean, I'm sorry, I wasn't meaning like that you weren't trying. I mean, like on the council, like someone's going,
Right,
hey,
no.
this is a thing, and that's what I meant. I apologize. I did not mean to imply.
No,
it was
I agree. It does help having a voice on the council that is trying to do these things. So I do appreciate that, Brooks.
Yeah. That's all I got.
Why do we take private streets and demand that these guys make them public, that they build the streets and then make them public? Do
We
still
don't
do that?
We don't demand they do that. They want to do that. And
wanna
they
just
hand it, they hand
build it
over
and hand it
substandard,
over?
they
Because then
hand
we
over
have to pay for the
substandard
maintenance
streets.
forever.
Yeah, basically we do it as part of, it is my criticism of the spread out growth model and why I am more gung-ho on infill and dense development, because the sprawled out model, as we saw in that map, we just don't get enough revenue. And I bet if we were to see the expenditures, we'd show we're spending more money than we're getting in. So it's why I'm a firm believer in anything that boosts the density of an area is a financially productive good. Plus, you preserve untouched land and all that fun stuff.
So that street that behind Bay, what's the name of this? Bay Village. Is that going to be public or private?
The connector between the Lidl,
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that it's definitely city property, and we get Connect City
No,
water
it's
and
on city I don't think it's on city property.
The new
well, the
Lidl,
The Lidl's going to be in the county.
Not
And
not the Lidl, but the connect, that Edgewood Road extension, and then it turns, they name it a different name. They name it Bay Village Road or some nonsense, but that connector and that goes over towards Lidl between Bay Village Assisted Living and Bay Village Independent Living, right?
Mhm.
Tommy, do you know what I'm talking about? The street that's
Proposed.
talked about shrinking its width and all of that last time. Anyway, we'll find out next. That you don't need to answer that now, but that's a question to
The
ask.
original concept with all of that, by creating that connector street, was that eventually there could be a parallel street that went behind Lidl and could potentially connect all the way to Hillsmere Drive, even though that, there was a concept with doing that, and that property is subdivided so that there is a street grid in it.
All right, well, we'll talk about it in a public hearing.
Mhm.
All right, well, okay. Do
I'm
I get,
afraid the
do we have
chair-
to move to adjourn a meeting that's already been adjourned?
It's a good
I
question.
move to adjourn.
I second.
No, we want to stay.
Bye.
I mean, I haven't eaten since 11:30, so if we're good, I'm probably gonna jet myself.
Thank you guys for
Go
listening
eat.
and comments.
All
Very
right.
much appreciated.
Thank you, Karma, and welcome.
The
I haven't
opportunity.
actually seen you before.
Very good.